Leiden successfully defended against the Spanish siege. The city is rewarded with the first university in the Netherlands. Almost 250 years later, the long tradition of teaching archaeology in Leiden commences. Gosper Rovens is appointed as Professor of Archaeology, the world's first, and soon archaeology is recognized as an important discipline. In our disciplines, there is nothing besides archaeology that teaches us so evidently the many things we do not yet know. Strong international ties are forged and students and staff travel abroad to do field work, an aspect of the study that remains important to this day. Knowledge is exchanged with other faculties in Leiden and with universities around the world. Different strands of archaeology flourish at Leiden University, and in 1997, all their strengths are combined. The Faculty of Archaeology is born. Home to world archaeology, science and heritage programs, Leiden offers several unique specializations and groundbreaking research, such as the Human Origins program and its focus on the earliest use of fire. Open to alternative perspectives, archaeologists from Leiden work hand in hand with other disciplines, experts and local communities, like the extraordinary research into the pre-Columbian inhabitation of the Caribbean, reconstructing ancient networks of mobility and exchange. This way, in-depth knowledge of a specific culture area is combined with general theory. New archaeological techniques are continuously being explored. In Italy, using drones, students have recently found several new Roman sites. Education is directly linked to ongoing research and fieldwork around the world. Excavating medieval settlements or Bronze Age burial mounds in northwestern Europe, surveying a natural passage in the mountains in the Near East, helping uncover the collapse of the Mammoth Steppe ecosystem in Siberia, or working on pictorial manuscripts with indigenous people in Mesoamerica.
Aha, it should work now. Of course, you can't start a virtual activity without some minor technical difficulties. So once again, thank you all for being here and welcome to the Virtual Experience Day. Before we start with the rest of the program, I'll go through some of the house rules for today. First of all, I also want to tell you that we are recording this for mainly training purposes and perhaps to later put this online so you can watch it back. So the house rules for the rest of the event is please activate your microphones. This way we can give you the floor later during the presentation if you have a question, but do make sure that they are muted throughout the rest of the presentations. You don't need to activate your webcams. This is something you can do later on for the Q&A with the students. It might make it a bit easier to talk to each other, but if you're not comfortable with sharing your webcam, this is of course not necessary. The program will end at 4:30, so roughly 1.5 hours. And please only ask questions at the end of the presentation. After every presentation, we have a bit of time for questions. And you'll notice somewhere in the top right of your screen, there's a raise hand button. If you have a question, please press this button, then we'll bring you forward so you can ask your question and get the answer. Now, if you have a shorter question, please use the Q&A chat on the right. We want to keep the room chat only for technical difficulties, like your mic is muted, Jan, and that kind of thing. And please use the Q&A chat for the questions. Now, if you have a personal question that you don't want to share with the rest of the chat, you can always send an email to studentambassador@arc.leidenunit.nl or use the Unibody chat with a student function from the website. That way you can get your questions answered even after this event. Now, for the rest of the program, we'll have 2 presentations by staff members. But before that, I'll give a short introductory presentation about what archaeology actually is and what studying archaeology here in Leiden means. After that, Dr. Rachel Schatz will give a presentation about sex identification in human bones. First, Aris Politopoulos, a PhD student and lecturer here at Leiden, will present on the Near Eastern Bronze Age empires, and after that it will be Rachel's turn. And we end the program with a Q&A with students where you'll be divided into small groups and get the opportunity to ask all your questions to real-life archaeology students. And I think that's it for the program, and we'll now begin with the first presentation. So you're all here today to get to know a bit more about what it is like to study archaeology. And there are many different misconceptions out there on what archaeology actually is. It's one of the least understood disciplines probably out there. And if you do indeed choose to study archaeology, you'll undoubtedly be confronted with scenarios like this when you get home to your parents or talk again with friends from high school. So what do we actually do here in Leiden with archaeology? Well, archaeology is the study of the behavior and activity of humans in the past, which means that we don't do dinos and we don't do treasure hunting. Instead, we focus on societal issues that are still very relevant to us now today, as they were in the past. Think about globalization, migration, health, climate change. All these issues were as important in the past as they are now. And as a result, because the things we study are so diverse and broad, our methods are very multidisciplinary. We use methods from all the various branches of science, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. Now, of course, you don't have to be an expert in each of every one of these to be a good archaeologist, nor do you need to have complete mastery of them in order to start studying archaeology. However, there is, of course, always the opportunity to specialize in each of one of them. This is kind of a spectrum, and where the place of each and every individual archaeologist on the spectrum differs on their own personal interests and talents. So what does this all look like? Very varied, as you can see. The top picture on the left is very typical of Dutch commercial archaeology, but you can even see there the influences of new techniques in digital archaeology, like drones, taking place. But you can also, for example, do ethnographic studies in the Caribbean, trying to document how current peoples nowadays make pottery, and if this has changed or still similar to pottery techniques in the past. And of course, I already mentioned digital techniques a bit. We can also do research outside of Europe, for example, studying tombs in the Near East. And sites in the Near East are, of course, not available all here to us. So by 3D scanning them, we can excavate them from home, so to say. So you can take your site with you to Leiden. So this is a bit about on what archaeology actually is. But how does the study program look like? So our bachelor offers to give you a broad basis on archaeology in order to prepare you to specialize later on. You will learn basic knowledge of archaeology, of the development from the latest hunter-gatherers to the earliest cities and states in various parts of the world. Think of the Near East, the Mediterranean, Northwestern Europe, the Mesoamericans, but also the evolution of our lineage since our split with the chimpanzees and bonobos to where we are now. And archaeology, though it is focused on the past, is not just about the past. You'll also learn how these archaeological issues are still relevant for current societies. And why do we actually practice archaeology? All these kinds of questions you'll be taught when you choose to study archaeology. The bachelor in archaeology is also a perfect place for more development in personal skills. Writing, for example, is a huge part of studying archaeology. And if you choose to study archaeology, I will guarantee that you won't recognize your own writing in about 3 years. And this is, of course, a skill that's not just useful within archaeology, but within any academic discipline. And the 3-year bachelor is also aimed at providing you the opportunity to discover your own archaeological interest. Now, our bachelor is in English from the 2nd year onwards. In the 1st year, you still have a choice between a Dutch and an English version. However, please do note that even if you follow our Dutch bachelor, you will have to follow some courses in English. Some of our staff are, after all, international and do not speak Dutch. You can still write your exams and essays in Dutch throughout your 1st year, throughout your entire bachelor, I'm sorry. Our bachelor also consists of 2 tracks, the World Archaeology and the Heritage and Society track. The World Archaeology track is more the traditional archaeology, so to say. It focuses on learning how to gather new archaeological data, for example, by means of excavating, how to interpret this data, and how to place it in a larger regional framework as to understand what this actually means for our view of how people in the past lived. The Heritage and Society track takes place afterwards. So We have our archaeological interpretation. We think we know what people were doing in the past, but why is this relevant to us now? How do we involve local communities in our research on the past? And who owns this past? Are some people more entitled to this heritage, or does it belong to us all? Now that you know something about the structure of our program, it roughly follows a pyramid. In your first year, you'll mainly have general courses, which you'll share with all the other first years. And then at the end of your first year, you'll get to choose between the two tracks I named earlier. And your choice of track will determine the last two courses of your first year, namely the type of fieldwork that you're going to do. Then in your second year, these two tracks diverge a bit more. The differences become larger. You also need to choose your specialization seminars, which give you an opportunity to decide what you want to specialize in later. And this all builds up to your thesis in your third year, which will be your first independent research project, where you have the opportunity to really do research in something that you find interesting. Now, this is basically what studying archaeology in the bachelor looks like in Leiden. But what do you actually learn if you choose to study archaeology? I always find it kind of abstract. If you read about a program and the like, what kind of things would you now actually get to learn? Well, archaeology is about the story of mankind, which starts after our divergence with chimpanzees and bonobos and continues throughout evolution to where we are nowadays. You'll get to learn about the differences and the similarities between those ancient hominin species and us. And many people view these now extinct hominin species as archaic and primitive. But if you put a Neanderthal in a suit and put him on the subway during rush hour, I don't think people would look up twice. And this is some of the new interesting perspectives that you will get to learn when you're studying archaeology. Now, archaeology is about more than just Neanderthals and extinct species. We also focus on many other parts of history. For example, the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture is an important milestone in human history. And Çatalhöyük, picture you see in the top right, is a very important example of a site which was fundamental in shaping our understanding of this period. Most people equate cities with agriculture. You can't have a city without farming. However, Çatalhöyük was a city of at least 3,000 to 10,000 people located in southeastern Turkey. And it's a remarkable city because all the inhabitants were still hunter-gatherers. Another thing truly interesting about the city is that there were no streets. All movement and transport took place by route. Now in Leiden you can also focus in the more traditional archaeology, so to say. I mean, most people think about the Greeks and the Romans when they think of archaeology, and that is also something you can study. But if your interests lie more west than Europe, that's not a problem. The Mesoamericas and Caribbeans are two regions in which we have very good research groups available at Leiden, and you can also learn more about those. Now, as I mentioned, we are in archaeology, it's about studying the story of mankind. But the story of mankind isn't some grand book buried 20 meters beneath the surface waiting for us to discover it. Rather, it's a puzzle of thousands and thousands of pieces. And the pieces that we use are the artifacts that we find. And using these artifacts, we can learn how they were produced. Where did the raw material come from? What were they used for? How did their shape and function change through time? And sometimes, when we find human remains, we can even say something about the individual lives of people in the past. Did they suffer diseases? How did they die? Were they active or not? All these kinds of questions you can answer with archaeology, as well as bigger issues like mobility. Many people think that the huge mobility we were accustomed to prior to the coronavirus is due to the huge innovations in transportation techniques like cars, trains, planes, etc. And that people in the past never left their village of birth. However, if we look at the archaeological records, we see that people were already incredibly mobile in the past, and that they often moved large distances. Now, diet is something very important in our lives today. Whether you are a vegan, a vegetarian, or a dedicated meat eater, is part of your identity, as well as it does it say something about your socioeconomic status. This is no different from the past. By researching the diet, we can discover a lot about the relationship between people within their society as well as with nature. Now, climate change is of course also a big issue nowadays, and many of you probably knew that Europe suffered through several ice ages in the past. But how many of you knew that we also encountered subtropical periods here? There were times when there were leopards, hippos, and elephants walking around right here in the Netherlands. I even found a piece of one of them during one of my fieldwork excavations. So this is a bit about what you'll learn when you choose to study archaeology. But I thought that perhaps you also might be interested to know why I chose to study archaeology. What could drive someone to such madness as to actually do this? And I hope that my story might inspire you as far as that's possible on why I did this. So the main reason why I chose to study archaeology is because I wanted to combine the humanities and the natural sciences. As a kid, I was always incredibly passionate about history and I wanted to know more. But when I got to high school, I discovered that I really liked the natural scientific courses as well. And when the time came for me to choose what to study, I wanted to combine the two. And quite quickly, I discovered that there were only two options. You either study one of the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, you name it, finish your degree, get a job, and then hope that once you get a project where you'll actually do something with the past. The other opportunity is to study archaeology. If you choose to study archaeology, the knowledge that you will gain about the natural sciences will never be as in-depth as it would have been if you'd studied chemistry or something like that. However, you will get the opportunity to combine your two interests from day one. And for example, now I'm using, for my thesis, I'm researching the application of proteins to the past and what we can learn from the different concentrations of these proteins about the individual lives of people in the past. So you can continue in this direction and you can specialize it. Another thing that always interested me about archaeology is that you're really busy with discovering new information, which may seem very straightforward. I mean, all science is about learning new things and discovering new data. But with archaeology, if you're at an excavation and you found a piece of bone or an artifact, that's the first time in thousands of years since that object has seen the sunlight. And that I always found that so appealing and interesting. Lastly, a bonus of all these excavations and field work is, of course, that you get to see the world a bit. But I would not recommend anyone to make this their primary reason for studying archaeology, but it's a nice bonus. So why Leiden then? I mean, you can study archaeology at many different universities in the world. In the Netherlands, you get to choose between Groningen, Amsterdam, and Leiden. Well, the main reason why I chose Leiden was because of its international orientation. Groningen and Amsterdam focus primarily on Dutch archaeology, and although it's very interesting, I prefer to have a bit of a broader choice, especially since I didn't know what I wanted to specialize in yet. Secondly, Leiden has an outstanding reputation in research, and although a good researcher does not necessarily make a good teacher, you do learn a lot from working with good researchers. Having them as your supervisor for your thesis, their expertise and knowledge does trickle down and help you to become a better researcher. The facilities in Leiden are also a lot better than many other universities. We have 5 different labs ranging from the study of human bones, more on that later, to digital archaeology, as well as many others. This wide choice and opportunity to apply these techniques in practice is something that's quite rare. Lastly, the ambience at Leiden is great. In Leiden, archaeology is its own faculty, something quite rare in the world. And it really does change how people view it here. We have our own building, and usually it's filled with only archaeology students, and you'll soon get to learn, at least by face, most of them, which really creates a nice community feeling. And well, that brings us to this. So everything Indiana Jones has taught you about archaeology is wrong on many, many different levels. However, there is one thing he does show you right, and that's this dichotomy between an adventurous and an academic side. And in the films, the adventure is around 95% of the time, and the academic side is only 5%. In reality, it's the inverse, but the distinction remains. And in real life, the adventure side mainly takes place during fieldwork. On the right, you'll see a picture of me during my first year's fieldwork, where you get to learn how to excavate, which is just basically a bunch of first years in a trench, learning how to not screw things up. But these large wide trenches are quite typical for Dutch archaeology. And then on the left, you see a much different excavation, very cramped, much smaller, a cave some 40,000 year olds in southwestern France. The find density there was so much higher. During my first year's field school in the Netherlands, I found 2 pieces of pottery over an entire week. In France, we found around hundreds of lithics every day, per person that is, which shows you that the different techniques you need to apply to actually extract the most amount of data that you can differs enormously per region and period. Now, fieldwork can be a lot more than just excavating. Some of you may already have noticed the burning house on the left corner, which is a house we built with Neolithic stone tools in order to uncover how much of an effort it actually is to build a house like that and what kind of wear and tear this leaves on the tools we used. Now, after a while, this project came to an end, and we were faced with 2 choices. We either could let the bulldozers destroy the house, or we could do an experiment. And so we did, because you see in the archaeological record, we sometimes find traces of burning, and we wanted to know if we know the location of everything inside this house. We know how the house looks like, how it has been made, and we set it aflame. Can we use this knowledge to extrapolate it to the archaeological record? Can we use this to decide whether other houses in the past have actually been burned? Now, my main interest in archaeology, apart from proteins, is human origins. And as you all might know, humanity originated in Africa, which is why I decided it was absolutely vital that I go to Africa to learn more about it. And here again, you can see that an excavation is so different depending on where you are. On the left, you'll see the excavation, basically, which was just a 3 meter by 3 meter by 3 meter pit, where I spent the better part of a month. And again, here we found around, I think, 10,000 artifacts over the month, which just shows you that you really need to adapt your methods to where you are. Now, fieldwork is also the perfect opportunity for some personal development. Many people think that humans are the most advanced and complex species out there, and that we are better than everyone else. And yet, in the race for resources, I did lose to this small, more primitive cousin of ours, which does show that in evolution, all species are equally advanced, and that also that evolution never stops, but is still going on today. Well, apart from playing around in Africa, I also did some professional things. For my thesis, I wanted to do something which is not conventionally done in Leiden. So my supervisor arranged that I could go to Leipzig in Germany to work in the lab there, which shows you that even if you want to do something that's not possible here in Leiden, with the right kind of support, you can make it happen. Later on, I presented this research to the private collectors whose artifacts I'd used, which again shows that if you are interested in working with local communities, in this case local Dutchmen, but at least you want to make sure that your knowledge is actually shared, you can already start being active in this during your education. Remember that house we set aflame? In the bottom right, you see a picture of the excavation of that house, which I helped organize. As a student of archaeology, you're not just someone who only has to do what they're told, a slave only suited for digging. You can actually already be involved with the higher levels of research design, deciding what to do, why, and how it's best to extract the most amount of data from the limited tools and funds that you have. Having said that, it's time for the future, which is something that many people often dread, because, oh no, jobs. However, there's no reason to despair. 85% of our alumni finds a job within 3 months, and most of them actually end up in archaeology. You see here in this graph, the consultancy archaeology, the heritage, land management, research. Most of these jobs are archaeological. So the chance that you'll actually get a job within your field are quite large. Now, if you're indeed interested in archaeology, please make sure to follow us on all our social media. And having said that, the time for questions for my presentation will follow later. I will give the floor to Aris, who will now tell you a bit more about the Near East.
All right, I hope you can all hear me properly. Hi everyone, I am Aris Politopoulos and I'm a lecturer indeed at the Faculty of Archaeology. Thankfully not a PhD student anymore as I am done with my dissertation. And I will talk to you a little bit today about what I've been teaching and the stuff that you can study in relation to the Near East if you study in Leiden. I will be talking to you about the Near Eastern, about the empires of the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the late Bronze Age, because it's a topic that I find extremely exciting, and it can give you a very nice overview of the multitude of things that you can do when it comes to archaeology of the Near East. It's not very monolithic, it's actually very complicated and has a lot of things to do. So when we're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean world, we are looking indeed at the Eastern Mediterranean Sea that includes Greece, Egypt, modern-day Turkey, Cyprus, the Syro-Palestine region, but it also extends a little bit inland, not necessarily touching the Mediterranean, and that is in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. And when we're talking about the late Bronze Age, we're talking roughly about 1500 to 1100 BC. And there are a number of cultures and empires that rose during that period that present all sorts of differences, but also at the same time show how connected the world was at that point, and how, in order to understand each individual empire or polity, you really have to study them also all together in terms of how they were connected. Now, very important in archaeology is the matter of chronology. So when things happened and how do we structure the chronology of our sites, the chronology of our materials. And when it comes to the late Bronze Age, it's actually a very complicated matter because each individual area had its own chronology rules. So it's not something I'm gonna discuss with you today, but understanding chronology is something that you learn when you study archaeology. And it's one of these fundamental skills that you need to get. One of the first empires that are relevant for the late Bronze Age Near East is, of course, the Assyrian Empire, and particularly what we call the Middle Assyrian Empire. It rose somewhere in 1350 BC, and its apparent end, at least the Middle Assyrian phase, was about 1000 BC, although it followed up later on to become the first and biggest empire the world had seen at that point, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. However, things started from this small city called the city of Ashur, located on the western bank of the river Tigris, a relatively small city, about 60 hectares, and it was mostly populated by traders. There's not much agricultural land around it, and as a result, its inhabitants had to resort to trade. They were famous for being extremely good traders, and the term Assyrians, comes actually from the city of Ashur, the name of the city. Actually, there is Ashur, the god, as well, and the city and the god Ashur are, at least in Assyrian ideology, indistinguishable. They really believed that the city and the god were really one. You can think of it very much like Rome and the Romans. Now, the core area of the Assyrian Empire is what you see on the right. That includes all sorts of other important sites. But it was during that time, so during the late Bronze Age, that actually Assyria expanded significantly. It is not really shown on this map, but it is even possible that by 1100 BC, it might even had reached the coast of the Mediterranean. So starting from this tiny city-state, when it got its independence from the previous empire, the Mitanni Empire, it managed to become one of the most influential and bigger empires of the region, reaching all the way out to the Mediterranean, even conquering the city of Babylon to the south. At the other end of the geographical spectrum, so Assyria, and what we're seeing is on the east and at the west of the map that we saw is the Aegean, which includes the Greek mainland, Western Anatolia, and Crete. The Aegean Sea is surrounded by these lands, and there we have the two famous cultures, the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations. Now, the Minoan civilization sort of comes to an end somewhere at the beginning of the late Bronze Age. There is a lot of speculation about how the Minoan civilization ended in relation to the eruption of the Thera volcano, but this is something that is still ongoing. People have not really concluded. Following up, however, on this downfall, the Mycenaean palaces came to power, and of course, you probably know the Mycenaeans in general by the Trojan War. Homer wrote two very famous epics, the Iliad and Odyssey. Maybe you are more familiar with the modern iteration of Troy, featuring Brad Pitt, the movie that is. But a lot of research regarding the Mycenaeans actually started from the study of these Homeric poems, and this is something that is seen even today. A lot of things that have been found are attributed to kings or heroes coming from these epics, like the Mask of Agamemnon or the Treasury of Atreus. Of course, we don't really know if this was the case, yet still we are closely reading the Homeric poems if we want to investigate the period of the late Bronze Age Aegean. What we call the Mycenaean Greece is actually located in the Peloponnese and a little bit to the north. So where Athens is today, Thebes, and at the eastern end of Thessaly. And in there, we don't really have an empire like we have with the Assyrians, but we more have smaller palatial states. These is states that are organized around one single palace, and these palaces are all over the place. So we have a palace in Mycenae, we have a palace in Laconia, we have a palace in Pylos, and each palace has a surrounding hinterland around it that it extracts resources from. It's a very different way of doing things politically, and yet the Mycenaeans, much like the Assyrians, managed to thrive during that period and extend their influence all the way to the Syro-Palestine region. Of course, very important at that point is also Egypt. The period of the late Bronze Age is termed in Egyptian archaeology as the New Kingdom Egypt, starting from about 1500 BC and ending together with the rest of the late Bronze Age somewhere in 1100 BC. A New Kingdom Egypt tends to be studied kind of individually outside of everything else. This is a little bit the fact here in Leiden as well. The Egyptology department lies with the humanities, and we don't really have it together with the Faculty of Archaeology, but that doesn't mean you cannot study it, because there is a lot of collaboration happening between the Egyptology department and Leiden University. So during the New Kingdom from Egypt, we have one of the most well-preserved and best textual archives that talk to us about what is happening in the Eastern Mediterranean in general. Maybe you have heard of the city of Akhenaten, Akhenaten being this sacrilegious pharaoh who decided to change his name and introduce a new religion to the Egyptians. It's a unique thing that had never happened before or after. And he created a new capital city to worship his god Aten instead of the traditionally worshipped god Amun. He is very important besides the religious aspect, because in this capital we have this amazing archive called the Amarna Letters. This is an archive from his father and himself, and it is a correspondence between these two individuals and other kings from literally everywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. So from Greece, from the Hittites, from the Assyrians, what have you, and even small city-states, Cyprus, literally everything. And this gives us a lot of crucial information about how the world was actually connected during that time. This is something very important to keep in mind. These letters, I'm not going to read it out because it's a little bit of a long text, but I wanted you to have an idea that these letters are actually read quite personal. They usually are between kings who exchange gifts. So in this case, we have the king of Egypt who sends a letter. We have the king of the Mitanni, who sends a letter to the king of Egypt, to the pharaoh. And with that, he also sends gifts to show his goodwill towards the pharaoh and that they consider each other friends. These two major powers find it very important to acknowledge each other's power. This is something that happens even today, right? You often see prime ministers visiting other countries and bringing a gift from their own country as a showing of goodwill. And this shows that the political situation, even at that point in this connected world, was very important. Diplomacy was crucial in late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Another important place was, of course, Cyprus. Cyprus, a very small island compared to all these big empires, was crucial because of its production of copper. The Bronze Age is characterized, of course, by the use of copper. When you use copper and tin, it produces bronze, this metal that was very important. And Cyprus is very rich in copper. Its name actually comes from copper. The word for copper at that point, kupros, which was later transliterated into Cyprus. During that period is called Alassia, and interestingly, no other power ever tried to annex it, to control it, even though it had the most rich sources of this precious metal. It always managed to hold its independence. Much like, again, you can compare it to now, where countries sometimes try to control oil sources, and yet still it's not always about conflict, because of course if one polity controls all the resources, then every other polity will be angry. So you didn't want to have a clash of empires at that point. Cyprus was also organized a little bit similarly to the Mycenaeans, although not exactly with palaces, but with very small cities that had influence over some areas of Cyprus. And it's unclear, actually, this term Alassia that we read in the text, if it refers to the entire island or to one king, or what is exactly Alassia. If Cyprus was understood at that period as one unified not empire but state, or not. This is very much unclear still, but we do know that different polities in Cyprus were controlling different copper resources. Looking a little bit to the east of Cyprus, we also have another very important place, which is the city-states of the Levant. These city-states work pretty much like you would think the classical Greece city-states, so cities that have a surrounding hinterland and they have their own king, and they were very important trade nodes. All of the trade from Assyria and from inland Mesopotamia was going through the Levantine region to the Hittites, to Cyprus, to Greece, or to Egypt. So this area and all these city-states were very, very important for trade. For that reason, and because it was important to have at least control over this as an empire, we also have at some point probably the most famous conflict of the late Bronze Age besides Troy, which is the Battle of Kadesh, which is the only battle that ever happened between the Hittites and the Egyptians. The Egyptians wanted to exert influence over that region, the Syro-Palestine, and the Hittites as well. And at some point, their economic interests were conflicting so much that both decided to march their armies and to have a fight outside of the city of Kadesh. Now, the Egyptians claim to have completely obliterated the Hittite army, and that it was a decisive victory. Yet, it's probably not the case, because after that, we actually see in the material horizon, so through archaeology, we see that Egyptians starts to pull out of there, and more Hittite influence becomes present. Talking about the Hittites is the other really big empire of the late Bronze Age that thrived during the late Bronze Age and is located in modern day Turkey, also termed in archaeological terms as Anatolia. And it's, together with the Assyrians, the two biggest empires of the late Bronze Age. Also has a relatively complicated chronology, but of course, the late Bronze Age corresponds to what we call the Hittite Empire period, the old and the later younger empire. The Hittites take their name from their corresponding capital, the city of Hattusa, which is located in a very rough terrain inland in Anatolia, and it really thrived during the late Bronze Age. You see something between 10 to 25,000 people could live in the Hittite capital at that point, and it was also called the city or the land of 1,000 gods, because during that time they decided to create this program of building a lot of temples for gods from all over their empire to show how multinational and multi-ethnic their empire was. They exerted their influence all the way to the Aegean Sea, and they have several minor conflicts with the Mycenaeans because both of them wanted to have something to say about Western Anatolia or Asia Minor, and there is a lot of correspondence about this. It also even seems that the Hittites lent a hand of help to the Trojans when they were fighting the Greeks. All of this amazing history and archaeology culminates to what is known as the late Bronze Age collapse. Towards the end of the 11th century BC, this is how the map has evolved, right? At about 1250 BC, we have this incident that this complex political system with all these intertwined networks and all these different empires just abruptly collapses, just disappears from the face of the earth, and the Hittites are no more, and Egypt goes in a complete downfall, and Greece changes completely, and only the Assyrian Empire manages to survive. So how did this happen? How did this almost global system, you would say, collapsed? There are a lot of theories. One of the most prominent ones, although one of the most questioned ones, but it's an interesting field of study, is what is called the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians, and particularly Ramses III, talks about these invasions of people who are coming with ships, so coming from the sea, and are pillaging his hinterland, pillaging the Egyptian villages, pillaging everything. In a lot of these texts, it says that all these foreign countries were making conspiracies and they were attacking literally everything. They were attacking Cyprus, they were attacking Syro-Palestine, and then they also came to Egypt, with which Ramses claims Egypt was prepared for this. It was just a confederation of various populations. This is what is interesting about this, is that all these sea peoples are not described as some kind of vicious army, even though they are presented as a major threat. We actually see them as people coming with their families, with animals. So it's not really a confederation of army, but it seems more like a confederation of refugees who are trying to relocate for some reason. So traces of collapse had already started happening at that point, and large populations were trying to move from place to place to find a more sustainable living place. Movements of the sea peoples can be seen here, or at least how it has been interpreted. So as you can see, sea peoples appeared in Egypt, in the Hittites, in Syro-Palestine, in Greece, and in Egypt. But after this invasion, and without any other traces, both the sea peoples disappear, but also all these empires disappear. And we are entering the first millennium BC, what is called the Iron Age. So, thank you for bearing with me on this long overview. I hope it was not too complicated, and I hope it excites you to study this kind of archaeology, because it really is a very exciting period and region. And of course, you can learn much more here in Leiden as well. Thank you.
So we now have about 5 minutes of questions. If anybody has a question, please use the raise your hand button, and we'll give you the floor.
Or of course, you can type it down in the chat as well, if you don't want to. And I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat. There is one about studying ancient Egypt in the archaeology faculty. So currently it's not exactly, while we do have some studies related to Egypt, we don't have a dedicated department on the study of Egypt. So there is, you can study Egyptology at the Faculty of Humanities, or for example, within the Mediterranean archaeology, they are doing a lot on Roman Egypt, or we do have some other projects related to Egypt, but there is not a dedicated department on the archaeology of Egypt within the faculty. And there was one more, I believe, in the main chat. Did this collapse have an impact only on this area or also outside of this region? No, definitely also outside. What followed the late Bronze Age collapse was really a reshaping, and we do see changes happening. So maybe we're talking about this region over here now that is colored on this map, but definitely to the north of Greece and modern day Balkans, we also see a lot of changes, right? And if we would look at the far east of modern day Turkey, we also see a lot of changes in the archaeological horizon. It is that what we term the late Bronze Age collapse mostly affected this colored region that we have on this map here. Jan, how do you want to do it? Because there are a number of other questions, and I feel like we're.
Yeah, I think we need to move on to the next presentation. Thank you.
Sorry for the rest, but I can answer to you when you come next year in Leiden.
Then we move to Rachel.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. So this is going to be a bit of a different presentation, focusing on something entirely different. I've entitled it, It's All About Sex, and in my topic it actually is, because I'm going to talk about osteoarchaeology, which is quite a different topic from what Aris just has discussed. It's more biology, because it is focusing on human skeletal remains. And in this presentation, we're going to see how we can identify males and females by just looking at their bones. So, okay, to start off a bit, giving you a bit of context on this topic. So the topic that I focus on and that I teach within Leiden, I teach this both in the second year, in the third year, and in the master. So there's actually quite a lot of attention for this particular topic. And this topic is named osteoarchaeology. And what this is, it is the study of human skeletal remains from an archaeological context. And particularly this last part, so this part focusing on the archaeological context is important, because what I do is not forensic archaeology. I think you are all too young to have seen the show Bones, but that is often the things that when I tell what I do, people say, oh, you're like Bones. I'm like, no, I'm not like Bones, because Bones analyzes skeletons from a forensic context, from people that have been murdered or got killed in a forensic setting, and that is not what I do. I only analyze skeletons that are found within an archaeological context, such as excavations that have happened on cemeteries. And that's, for example, an image you can see on the right here. This is from an excavation in the Netherlands, in Midden-Beemster. We've done a large-scale excavation there of the cemetery in 2011. And this is one of those individuals that we found. What we do is we analyze the bones. So we also excavate bones. We could excavate the bones, but our main focus really lies on the analysis of these skeletal remains when they are outside of the ground and they come to our laboratory in Leiden. We have a very nice facility in Leiden, a very nice osteological laboratory where we can analyze these bones. And we mainly focus on the estimation of sex. What is happening? My PowerPoint is gone. And it's back. Good. PowerPoint's back. We focus on the estimation of sex. That is also going to be the focus of today's presentation. We focus on the estimation of age, death. We try to estimate the stature of the person, meaning the adult height, so how tall was a person at that moment of death. And we look at certain diseases. Jan already mentioned it. We can see certain diseases within the skeleton, and this may tell us something about the lives of individual people, but also how diseases have changed throughout time, for example. And we all do this to learn about past individuals and populations. And I chose this area of research because I thought it was a very direct way of looking into the past, into the human past. I think you're all here part of this lecture because you are interested in what we were doing in the past, how populations lived. And you can, of course, do this on the basis of secondary information. That is, of course, what we also do at our faculty. But looking at the human remains is a very direct way of studying the past. And it also has a lot of biological components, of course. And that is what I really liked about this topic. So this presentation is going to be about the estimation of sex. Why? Because this is really the first step in every osteological analysis. So when you have a skeleton that comes into your lab, you first want to estimate the sex. And this is because all other analysis that you do really depend on it. So if you want to estimate age at death, you have separate methods for males and females, the same for stature. And also for diseases, pathology, it can sometimes matter if this person is a male or a female. And this will actually help you diagnose certain diseases in the skeleton. So the estimation of sex is very, very important. And I would like to share some methods that we apply for this analysis with you today. But first, we need to get a couple of things out of the way before we start. And that is that the estimation of sex is, unfortunately, of course I would like it to be, is really an estimation. It is not a determination. The only thing we have to go on is the skeleton. And although there are many differences between a male and a female skeleton, these differences are on a scale, and there is never a fully male skeleton and never a fully female skeleton. There's always some variation. So this can make it quite difficult, actually, sometimes to estimate the sex of a skeleton. If you have a complete skeleton, you can have a reliability up to 95%, but never up to 100%, meaning that we cannot really determine sex, but we can only estimate sex. if we only have a skeleton. If you would, for example, perform a DNA analysis, then of course we can actually determine the sex, but based on just the skeleton, it always is an estimation. Also important to know is that we can only estimate sex for adult individuals. Your skeleton will develop over time, but the sexual differences that we see between males and females will really only become apparent during puberty under the influence of hormones. So before puberty is complete, so under the age of 18, the differences between male and female skeletons are not that marked yet. So this is very difficult then to estimate sex. So this is not something that we normally do. The last point that I would like to make also is that sex and gender are not the same thing. Often in literature, you actually see that these terms are used interchangeably or used as synonyms, and this is actually not the case. What we can see in the skeleton is the sex of a person. It's the biological sex. And gender is more the psychological or societal aspect of being male or female. And although there is usually and quite commonly a relationship between gender and sex, this is not necessarily always the case. So what we can see in the skeleton is the sex, and it is very difficult for us to comment on the gender of that particular person. And this is also why I will not use the term gender in this presentation. So now that we've got that out of the way, we are going to start by showing you what we can actually use to estimate the sex of a skeleton. We use specific parts of the skeleton for this. So there are differences in every bone. The human skeleton has 206 bones, and between males and females there will be differences in every bone. But of course, for the estimation of sex, we want to use the bones that show the most differences, so are the most sexually dimorphic. And in the case of a human skeleton, this is the cranium, so your skull, the mandible, and the pelvis. So starting off with the cranium. The cranium has several features that we can look at for the estimation of sex. In general, males have a larger skull and have basically more markings on it. So everything is a bit bigger and more pronounced on a male skull. In females, the skull is generally somewhat smaller and everything is a bit more gracile and more sharper. And I hope you can see already a bit of this in the images that you can see on the right, but we'll look into that a bit more clearly, of course. So here we have a couple of traits that we can look at for the estimation of sex. What this chart is actually showing is showing where the trait is, and it's showing sort of the expression differences between males and females. So the one on the right, where it says a 1, that's basically the female expression, on the left, and then all the way at the right, you can see the male expression. So that's number 5 is the male expression of that particular trait. And everything in between is probable female, indeterminate, and probable male. So we're going to start off with the first trait, and that is called the external occipital protuberance, and it's located on the back of your head. And in females, the back of the head is generally quite smooth and you don't really feel anything there. But in males, there can be quite a marked ridge and sometimes even a hook can actually develop on the back of the head. And this is because the important muscle of your neck actually attaches to the back of their head here. And since men develop bigger muscles, they also need bigger attachment sites for those muscles. And even though we cannot actually have a practical now, you can feel these traits on your skull yourself. So what I would like you to do, even though I cannot see you, I'm trusting you that you are doing this, that is you put your hand on the back of your head, sort of where you would put your ponytail, if you would put a ponytail up, and feel if you can actually feel a bump there or not. In females, you would expect it to be quite smooth, and in males, you probably would feel a bit of a ridge and potentially even a bit of a hook developed here. Great tip, you can also see this really well on bald people. So you can never look at bald people the same way again. This is great. The other trait that you can also feel on yourself is the mastoid process. And the mastoid process is a bump that sits behind your ear. So right behind your ear, men have a big bump that extends very far down, whereas females only have a bit of a tiny little bump. I don't feel much here myself. Maybe it's 1 or 2, but men tend to have a big bump that extends quite far down. Your own skull. So try to feel this at the back of your head here. Try to feel if you have a bit of a bump at the back of your ear. Then the other trait that we have here, and this is also related to the images that you see on the right, we can actually look at the forehead, so the front of the skull. Men tend to have quite pronounced brow ridges. So where your eyebrows are, men tend to have a bit of a bump there, whereas females actually have a very smooth forehead that goes straight up, as you can also see in the images here on the right. So here with the men, you can see a bit of a bump, and here with the females, you don't actually see much appearing there. Yeah, somehow my sound all of a sudden really disappeared. I don't know what happened, but I think it is back again, right? At least I'm unmuted, it says. So hopefully you were able to hear my discussion on the skull, and you were able to feel it. Good. Because I would like you to show, I'd like you to show a bit more on this. And I've recorded a little video of a 3D model, which hopefully will give you a bit more insight in what the differences between a male and a female skull look like. If you come to Leiden, of course, I will have all the skulls available for you to look at, but here you have to make do with this little video.
So here we see a 3D model of a male skull. And from this image, it is quite clear that you can see that this individual has these marked brow ridges I've been talking about. So here you can see the elevation above the eyes, which is indeed where your eyebrows would normally be. Also from this view, you can see that the forehead of this male individual is not straight, so it doesn't go straight up, but actually slopes towards the back. And similarly, we can see that this individual has quite marked mastoid process if I rotate the skull.
The mastoid process is this big bump here that sits behind the ear, and you can see that it sticks out quite far down and is also very broad. And then lastly, the trait we discussed is this external occipital protuberance, so this big bump on the back of the head. And you can see that this individual clearly has a very marked ridge and almost a hook on the back of the head, which you can see from this view as well, clearly making this a male individual. So here then we see a 3D model of a female skull. Clearly from looking at the forehead, we can see that this is different. You can see here that the forehead does not slope towards the back at all. This forehead goes almost straight up and then only goes towards the back. And also it is clear that there are no brow ridges visible above the eyes here. So this skull here basically has no protrusions above the eye, making it a female individual. Also, if we look at the mastoid process, one of the other traits we've discussed, then you can see that these are much smaller than for the other individual that we just looked at. They are much less broad, they are very pointy, and do not stick out as far down as with the other skull. And then when we focus on the back of the head, in the other skull I've just shown, we saw a huge ridge and almost a hook on the back of the head. And this posterior aspect, so the back of this skull, is completely smooth. There's a bit of a bump here of the entire bone, but that has not really anything to do with the sex of this person. But the bone is otherwise completely smooth. So these traits make me believe that this is a female individual.
Okay, so thank you, Jan, for muting me and unmuting me. Sorry about that. I had to realize, I of course had to think about that a bit more. Sorry. But we're going to continue with the estimation of sex for the mandible. The mandible there shows also some differences, and a couple of these you can already see in this image here. Generally, a male mandible, so your lower jaw we're talking about, is robust and pronounced, and will have a bit of a square chin and also a bit of a square line right there. So the angle of the jaw tends to be a bit sharper and bigger in men. And in females, this tends to be a bit more robust and generally quite gracile with less of a pronounced chin. So here you can see that on the image here. So you can see that this hook of this mandible right here is quite sharp and pronounced, whereas it is very nice and rounded in this female individual here. And although this female actually has a bit of a chin, the chin appears to be bigger and more pronounced in these male individuals. There is, however, a bit of an issue, is that females in northwestern societies tend to have quite masculine jaws. So Dutch females tend to have quite masculine jaws, with making these the estimation of sex quite difficult on skeletons. So the mandible in Dutch skeletal remains is not extremely reliable. So here we see images of the skull, so with the mandible. So we see the top part, the cranium, and then the mandible associated with it, and a male on the left and a female on the right. So here you can also see the mastoid process, for example, being quite pronounced. So here you can see the mastoid process being bigger here than it is here. Again, you see a bit of a brow ridge here, although this male does not have this huge brow ridge as it sometimes can be. But this female doesn't really have anything at her forehead here. And here we can also again see that the mandible is much bigger and more pronounced in males than it is in females. Then the final part of the skeleton that we use for the estimation of sex is the pelvis. And the pelvis, or your hips, including your sacrum, which is the bone that sits between your both pelvic halves, and this is generally the most reliable part of the skeleton to look at. We look at various features, and the reason it is so reliable is because there is a very clear difference in function. So the differences I've discussed for the skull and the mandible are not because a male uses its skull differently than a female does. It's really more related to muscle and other kind of traits. But for the pelvis, of course, females need to be able to give birth. Even if you don't want any kids, you never want to have kids, you don't want to give birth, your body is biologically designed to be able to do that. So, and this has resulted in a couple of adaptations to the female pelvis, which we can actually see quite well in the skeletal record. So here we see side by side images of a male and a female pelvis, so completely together with the sacrum. So the sacrum is the bone that sits in between there. It sits at the bottom of your vertebral column. And on the left, we see the female, and on the right, we can see the male pelvis. And what is clear here is that the female pelvis tends to be wider and much more oval in shape, whereas the male pelvis tends to be a bit more heart-shaped. Let me see if I can do this. Well, that's not too bad. Sort of heart-shaped pelvis, where the sacrum actually is slightly more towards the front. If you would have a baby in there, the baby would actually bump its head on the sacrum. So that is very painful for everyone involved. So that is not very good if you want to have kids. A similar thing you can actually see at the front aspect of the pelvis. So that is what we're looking at the bottom images. You're looking at the pelvis from the front. So in this hole here that I'm highlighting now, this is where your upper leg will sit. And this here is your pubic bone, so your schaambeen in Dutch. So this sits at the front of your pelvis. And you can hopefully see here that the angle here is smaller than the angle here. And this is really because there needs to be a space for the baby's head to pass through underneath. And these traits we use to estimate the sex of the pelvis that we find within the skeletal record. And the pelvis, if you have a bit of experience with this, it is very easy to see and generally easy to do. So if you have a complete pelvis, including the pubic bone, so the schaambeen, then you can quite reliably estimate the sex of a skeleton. So the estimation of sex, of course, we have to then come to a final conclusion, and there can actually be quite conflicting scores within a skeleton. So occasionally you have a skull that says, well, it's a bit male, maybe probable male, and then you look at the pelvis, and then the pelvis is actually quite female. This can happen. This doesn't happen that often. Sometimes you have certain features that are more male and other features are more female, but you always have to take into account that which parts are most reliable. So in this case, it is really the pelvis. So you always have to put more weight on the pelvis, and then particularly on the pubic bone, which is actually the most reliable part of the pelvis. Only then you start taking into account the features of the skull. And lastly, particularly for Dutch collections, only then you actually take into account the mandible as well, because the mandible is considered to be the least reliable part of the skeleton for estimation of sex. We always come to a conclusion about either male or female. Sometimes when we are not actually really sure, we can say probable female or probable male, and then that individual is done for the rest of the analysis. So then we can start with the estimation of sex, stature estimations, and also looking into the diseases that person may have had. So I hope you got a bit out of this presentation, and that you will start seeing these traits on the skull everywhere you go right now. If you would, of course, come to Leiden, this is quite a big part of the curriculum. It is already part of the second year course. There is an entire specialization course devoted to this, and there is a complete master that focuses on osteoarchaeology. And Leiden is actually the only one that offers these courses in this much detail at an archaeological program. So if you are interested in this and you've liked what I have just discussed, then Leiden is absolutely a good choice for you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. So as most of you probably already noticed, we're a bit behind on schedule. But that's no issue. If you need to leave, you can just leave. For now, we'll continue on with first some questions about Rachel's presentation, and about after 5 minutes, I'll start with the breakout room function, which allows you to ask questions to other students in small groups. So Rachel, if you could do the questions now, I'll figure out the breakout thingy.
I also see a question in the chat from Ega, how to identify the sex of the skeleton if it's not complete, cracked, or missing. Well, then it becomes a bit more difficult. And usually I will then not confidently say that someone is male or female. I usually say, well, based on what I can see, I think this individual is a probable female, because then I just don't dare to say it for sure. If the individual is just missing most of its traits to be able to use, that I can use to estimate sex. For example, if there is only a part of the leg present or part of the ribs present, then I cannot really estimate sex. So then I just say that this individual is indeterminate. So I don't know the sex of this particular person. And you also have to be honest about that and not guess, because that is bad science, of course. Does anyone else have another question? I think there's another question in the chat. There is a question on how we can separate the bones in a grave with more skeletons. This is a good question, and this is not always easy. This really depends on the level of commingling, and that is really how the term that we use for when skeletons become mixed. So what we occasionally see when you are excavating a mass grave, I've actually excavated a mass grave in Alkmaar. This was part of a mass grave that was related to the 80 Years' War, and from 1573, a siege of Alkmaar. Maybe this rings a bell from history classes. And there was a mass grave there, but the individuals were actually very neatly placed side by side, and there was a little layer of soil, and then there was another person placed in the grave. So actually it was quite easy there to separate out the individuals. There was, of course, some mixing of the bones, and because most of the individuals had the same age and the same sex in that particular grave, it was quite difficult to really make sure that we placed the bones with the right individuals. But overall, most bones were quite easy to associate with their right individual. This becomes a lot more difficult if the mass grave is really mixed, or if individuals are placed into a pit that is sort of more vertical, they're thrown in, for example, then bones become really mixed. And if there are then no marked differences between age and sex, then this becomes quite difficult to separate the individuals. If there's, for example, one small female and one large male in that grave, then I would be able to separate the bones out quite easily. But if there are 3 males of 18, 20, and 23, and really similar ages, then it becomes very, very, very difficult. And then all I can do is say there are most likely 3 individuals, or there's a minimum number of 3 individuals in here, and that is what I have to then stop with. Okay, let me see. I see another question here. Question from Amber. Do you think that in the future this type of study will get harder because of our biological technology and our ways to manipulate the skeleton? Interesting question, really interesting. Well, it will be definitely less straightforward, I should think. But I think in general societies become maybe slightly less straightforward, so that probably fits with that. But indeed, if we're talking about skeletal alterations, people changing their jawline and changing their face, changing the structure of their skeleton, then it would be very difficult for me to do what I do. And also, indeed, with the changing of hormones, taking different hormones that will also influence the development, then that will become indeed quite difficult. But I do think that probably in the future we also will have better techniques that we can use potentially to trace this in a better way. We of course already have DNA analysis, we have isotope analysis, and for example, isotope analysis of hair, you can actually see what you ate up until you died. So that might actually help us parse out these more difficult things that people can do to their body. This field is quite designed for people not doing a lot to their body, and most of the methods are designed to that. So if we are going to analyze skeletons from the very recent past, then we will have to take that more into account. And actually there are now papers in forensic settings that start to appear on how to deal with transgender individuals indeed, because that is something, especially in forensic setting, that has become more important. So we are already starting to think about how we should deal with this and adapting our methods to that.
I hate to interject, but I think we should move on to the Q&A. So the other questions about osteology they can always email you, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So now we'll move to the Q&A, where you will now be put into a room with 2 students, or in one case, 1 student from Leiden, and you can ask them all your questions. Your microphone and webcam, I think, as well, will be automatically activated. We'll do this for around 15 minutes. I'll pass by all the rooms and see how it's going. Of course, you can continue longer if you want, or leave early. And yeah, see you in the rooms. So I think everyone is back again, rudely taken from their nice break room. I hope that you all enjoyed today's event and that you all learned more about archaeology and why you want to study it, or if this perhaps not the thing for you. If you have any final questions, now is the time. Right. And I'd like to remind you that you can always get more information about studying archaeology in Leiden from the following channels. And if you have any further questions after today, you can always send me an email or use the chat with the study function via Unibuddy. Yes, Sophie? Yeah. What's the question? I'll type it in the chat, the email address. What do you mean? Wait, I'll make you live, Sophie, so you can explain. Could you explain precisely what the question was?
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, the question was quite literally, what are study credits?
Okay.
And maybe that's good to know for the international students.
Yes. All right. Great. So thank you, Sophie. So study credits are basically a measure used by the university to guarantee that every study program takes around roughly the same amount of time and is as difficult, etc. So you need to, every year of an academic study at Leiden University and basically all Dutch universities, is 60 EC, so 60 study credits. Now, those 60 credits are divided between the various courses that you're following. Roughly every credit is equivalent to 28 hours in total of either lectures, practicals, just study. And most courses will be probably something like 5 credits. And if you have finished the course and if you've passed the exam and everything, you'll be awarded those 5 credits. Now, at the end of the first year, we have what is called a binding study advice, which means that if you don't get enough credits, you are not allowed to continue with the education program. And the limit is 45. So if you have less than 45 study credits, and there are no exceptional circumstances, you cannot continue onto your second year. However, this is usually not that much of a problem, and you'll be awarded those credits at the end of every course. There might be a possibility to watch this live chat later. You won't be able to get back into the break rooms, unfortunately. They will be closed and lost after this. But if you want to talk with a student, you can always use the Unibuddy chat function. Whether this recording will be posted online is something that we will decide in the coming week. And are there any other questions? All right, if that is all, then I want to thank you very much. Sorry for the Amber, no, it's not back. It's not possible to be back in the break rooms after this, to clarify. Now then, I want to thank you all for bearing with us. My apologies for the delay of half an hour. And I look forward to see you all in Leiden next year.